Hello and welcome to something a little bit different than I have done previously on this channel. Today I will be taking a look at the tank losses during the Russo-Ukrainian War for the months of February and March of 2022, also known as the opening 5.5 weeks or so of the war. For those of you who have been with me previously, you'll know that previously this was a wargaming, specifically a Cold War wargaming, and history channel. However, I no longer have sufficient time to continue doing that due to changes in, well, life and work responsibilities. I do apologize if that is what you came here for, but such is the way of things. From here on out, there will be a focus on open source intelligence analysis, also known as OSINT, which is another of my passions/hobbies, and one that I feel significantly less bad about the potential of having some pretty infrequent uploads regarding, as opposed to trying to run a wargame. This will mostly consist of taking a look at what various visual loss databases are able to tell us. And yes, I suppose this would be where you could insert a Perun at home joke. Specifically, I will be making use of war spotting when looking at Russian losses and lost armor when looking at Ukrainian losses. Yes, it would be better to use a single source, so the two datasets can be formed with as close to the same methodology as possible. However, really the only database that would allow me to use is Oryx. Now, Oryx is great. I've used it extensively for my own personal research that kind of led up to this OSINT project. However, Oryx has a pretty significant weakness. It doesn't have date or location data, and it's not particularly good when it comes to looking back at historical data because, as it doesn't organize itself by date, you're relying on archived versions of the page, and so it's not exactly backwards compatible with updates or changes. This results in it having pretty messy data when you're trying to, for example, chart things over time, as I will ultimately be doing in future videos. To start off, we will be looking at Ukraine's losses during the observed period. The reason that I'm starting with Ukraine is that their data is a little bit simpler, and it should be noted that I am making use of all visually identified losses, regardless of damaged, abandoned, captured, or destroyed. So you can think of these more as casualties than, strictly speaking, losses, as the objective is not to do things like count depletion rates, for example, covert cabal style. Even I'm not willing to purchase satellite data in order to count tanks and try and identify their 9 pixels, but rather to give an indicator of what the trends are. So, plus or minus a few tanks here or there isn't going to ultimately affect things in the long run. But I suppose I'm waffling a little bit again. During this opening period, Lost Armor would record 55 lost Ukrainian tanks, 4 of which are T-80s, 7 are T-72s, and the majority, 44, are T-64s. This makes sense given what we know of the composition of the Ukrainian tank fleet before the war. The considerable majority of their active tanks were T-64s. They had a small number of T-80s in their more elite air assault units, specifically company-sized formations attached to those brigades, rather than the battalion-sized formations that would be attached to, for example, a mechanized brigade. There were also a decent number of T-72s, although they were pretty significantly outnumbered in the active force by the T-64, and were much more of Ukraine's reserve tanks. If we specifically take a look at the Ukrainian T-80s, all 4 were the T-80BV, a little identification guideline to help you out if you too want to take part in a bit of tank spotting. The T-80BV has 3 small driver's periscopes in the center of the hull. The 3 small periscopes in the center is an extremely good indicator that you are looking at a T-80, as this feature is unique to them. Its infrared searchlight is located on the right side of the turret. and it makes use of Contact 1 ERA. This is the source of the V in its identification, and that is standard across Soviet tanks. If there is a V, it has had ERA added to it after the initial design. The T-80's exhaust is in the rear of the tank, and it has 6 road wheels. These are large, without significant gaps. There are no indents, and they have a thick rim. Looking at the Ukrainian T-72s, there's a bit more variety. One of them could not be identified for what particular T-72 it is. 3 are the T-72 AMT, 2 are the T-72 AV, 1 is the T-72B. The AV and B I will get back to when talking about the Russian losses. The AMT, however, is a Ukrainian upgrade of the T-72A. While there were various improvements made to it, the most easily identifiable visually is the inclusion of the Ukrainian Noj ERA. These are large rectangular blocks, although they can also be within Contact 1 bricks, which does make them occasionally a little bit harder to distinguish. However, the Noj side plates are a pretty good giveaway when it comes to T-72s, as they are a total of 8 plates, 2 high, 4 long, and cover about the front 2/3 of the tank. If we take a look at the Ukrainian T-64 losses during this period, we see 1 B1, 4 BM2s, 26 BVs, and 13 BV Model 2017s. A quick guide of the T-64 BV. It has 1 large driver's periscope in the center of the hull. Its IR searchlight is on the left side, which is an extremely useful indicator for a T-64, as no other base model has the IR searchlight on the left, although this will not be present if it is a Model 2017 version. If a Soviet, or Soviet descended tank, used to have an IR searchlight and no longer does, as part of an upgrade package, that is usually a pretty good indicator that it now has thermal sights, as thermal sights are the functional replacement for the significantly more limited IR searchlight. The ERA in use is Contact 1, the exhaust is in the rear, and it has 6 road wheels. These are small, which is another very good indicator of the T-64. These, due to being small, have some gap between them. It has 10 U-shaped indents in the wheel, and it has a thin rim. Those other T-64s observed, the B-1 does not have a Cobra missile sight. The Cobra is the gun-launched ATGM used by the T-64, and its sight is circled in red on the above tank, so that's absence indicates a B-1. The lower image is a BM-2, which is a T-64B that has been upgraded with Noj ERA. If it does not have an IR searchlight, it is the BM-2. If it has an IR searchlight, it is the BM-1. And now on to the Russians. According to Warspotting, during that first about 5-week period, the Russians lost 350 tanks, 12 of which were T-90s, 88 were T-80s, 240 were T-72s, and 10 were T-64s. The T-90s were available in relatively small numbers, as they have pretty much only been produced as post-Soviet tanks, and so for a considerable period of the history of the Russian Federation, their production numbers were low, and so there weren't a particularly large number of them when the war started, at least relative to other tank models. The T-80 was the more standard upper-tier tank, primarily found in the more prestigious or important units of the Russian army, although they could also be found in units that were based in regions where it was considered the T-80's performance characteristics were better suited than those of the T-72. The T-72, being the mainline tank of the Russian Federation, was, of course, the largest percentage of losses, and a small number of T-64s. Now, these T-64s most likely were in service with the proxy groups for the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Those groups have since been incorporated into the Russian military more broadly, and would most likely have come from Ukrainian stocks or units captured during the Donbass War that started in 2014. Of the T-90s lost, all 12 were T-90As. These can be identified by having one large periscope in the center for the driver, the Stora 1 dazzlers on the cheeks. These are circled in red and are pretty much unique to this tank, so are a very useful identifier. It also has contact 5 and relict ERA, or more specifically, it may have relict. Depends on the specific tank. Its exhaust is on the left side, and it has 6 road wheels. These are large with no gaps, they have U-shaped indents and thick rims. The Russian T-80s consist of 17 BVs, the same model as in use by the Ukrainians, 14 BVMs, 51 Us, 5 UE-1s, and 1 UM-2. The BVM is the most modern upgrade package to the T-80 that Russia makes use of. It retains the 3 small periscopes in the center for the driver. It does not have an IR searchlight indicating the use of a thermal sight, and its ERA is contact 5 and relict, whereas the T-90A might have relict or the contact 5 side skirts. The BVs are pretty much always going to have relict. The T-80U is a bit of an interesting one, as visually speaking it looks the most like some of the Ukrainian upgrades, largely due to the use of all of the rubber skirts and the side-mounted ERA not going as far back as on most other Russian tanks that have it. But it retains the right side IR searchlight of other T-80s, it does not have an ATGM sight, and its ERA is contact 5. Its side panels are 6 plates, 2 high, 3 long, and cover about the first third of the tank. Another indicator for this one is that the driver's periscope is a little bit more protected than on other T-80s, usually having some sort of a frame covering them, or at least surrounding them. The T-80 UE-1 has quite a few differences compared to the U, although by far the most visually apparent is the absence of the IR searchlight. The UM-2 is a particularly interesting one, as it is as far as we can tell, a unique prototype, which was a T-80U that was equipped with the Drozh 2 active protection system. You can see those little missile launcher-looking things on the lower tank. But as Drozh 2 didn't particularly go anywhere, it was not accepted more generally into service, so perhaps it is better to say the UM-2 as opposed to a UM-2. And now for the T-72s. 6 of which were unable to be identified. There were then 13 As, 4 AVs, 67 Bs, 30 B model 1989s, 48 B3s, 67 B3 model 2016s, and 5 BAs. So quite the variety. The T-72A has a large driver's periscope in the center of the hull. Its IR searchlight is on the right side of the tank. It does not have an ATGM sight. Its exhaust is on the left side of the tank, and it has 6 road wheels. These are large without gaps. They have U-shaped indents and a thick rim. You will note that many of these general characteristics are quite similar to the T-90, and that is because the T-90 is ultimately a descendant of the T-72. Specifically, the program was originally a modernization program for the T-72, but it evolved into something that required a new-built hull. Hence, it became the T-90, which allowed for quite a few other improvements, although many of the major visual cues do remain. As mentioned previously, the V being added to a designation indicate that it has had ERA added. So, the T-72 AV is an A that has had contact 1 ERA mounted. The B was a general improvement on the A and included ERA from the start. Therefore, there is no T-72BV. The main ways to tell a B apart from an A is that the contact 1 on the front of the B's turret is much flatter, almost vertical, as opposed to 2 pieces forming a wedge in the case on the AV. There is also a cutout on the underside of the front of the turret, and while this is a good visual indicator, it is not always the easiest thing to see. An improved version of the B would be the T-72B Model 1989, and it has had its Contact 1 replaced with the much more effective Contact 5. Continuing with the variations of the T-72B, we have the T-72BA, which is, visually speaking, a Model 1989 that has had a meteorological sensor added. That's the little pole sticking out of the top of the turret. Next is the B3. This looks quite a bit like a BA, although it doesn't have the IR searchlight, indicating the presence of thermal sights, and, at least on the Model 2016 version, will have the relict side skirts. The 2016 version may also include additional box and or bag ERA on the side of the turrets or hull. And that brings us to the 10 T-64 BVs. And that brings us to the end of this quick run-through of the tank casualties for about the first 5 weeks of the Russo-Ukrainian War. I will be doing additional videos, largely doing similar analysis, although with the added ability to check for trends over time, as well as probably expanding into also looking at the self-propelled artillery, as well as the infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers of the war. Unfortunately, that will be about as many system categories as I'm able to do, as I need to use categories that both Lost Armor and War Spotting cover. So things like towed artillery is not generally covered by Lost Armor, so I cannot compare the two sources to each other in their regards. I hope you have found this at least somewhat interesting, and that you'll stick around to see what comes in the future. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.